Let me just start by saying, Peter, thank you so much for agreeing to give us some of your time this morning and joining us for an episode of The Responsible Edge. You and I think we confirmed that we met, I think, back in September last year. So it's been some time since we first connected, but I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I feel like I'm going to learn an awful lot from you. If you can hold me gently through the process of understanding a little bit more about land planning and usage. But it's fantastic to have you on. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
And Peter, now I know we've got sort of a 20-minute period now to sort of talk about you and to explore your background. And I think what I'd really like to do, if possible, and I think our listeners would be particularly interested in this, is just understand, from looking at your, formative experiences, perhaps going back into, childhood, perhaps even, education, can you recall some of the most sort of impactful experiences that have kind of led you and driven you to ultimately then take the steps that you did throughout your education and into your professional career?
Short answer is no, not really, because I think it was interesting. I was listening to one of your other episodes recently, and one of the guests talked about falling into this sort of thing by accident, and that's chimes with my experience for sure. So I mean, when I was a teenager, I was intent on joining the military, and I did that. And I think had events played out in a slightly different way, I might still be in the military today. So, in terms of formative experiences, I set myself up for that particular career, and then when that didn't quite work out, I had to recalibrate. And then falling into a series of jobs from there has ended up in this position now. I find myself more motivated for that, because I think what I've done is sort of explored a whole variety of different things, seen the connections between them, and then been able to sort of bring that varied experience to bear in a role like I'm in currently, focusing on the biggest challenge that we have to deal with as a society.
And Peter, that was beautiful, and I love an abrupt no to the formative experience question. That was absolutely sensational and refreshing. But let me ask you about the military. Like, what was it about wanting to go into the military service that was so attractive to you as you were thinking about what you wanted to do with your career?
Well, I think I had a sort of sense of adventure, if that's not too sort of simplistic way to put it, but it's something that they obviously look for in the way that they recruit people. I've been a cadet and a youth leader, so I sort of experienced that side of things as a teenager and as a child. I'd had lots of military family. So in the Fab family, the Air Force family, the Navy, I think I said at one of my interviews at Selection Board that I thought about the Navy, but I get seasick. I thought about the Army, but I thought about the Air Force, but I get airsick. So I thought I'd land on the Army. And they forgave me for that and let me in anyway. So there's a bit of that motivation, but I think fundamentally for me, it was about acknowledging that if we're asking people to do dirty, difficult, dangerous things, that they deserve good leadership, and that I thought I could have a go at giving that good leadership throughout a career as an Army officer. And that was really the whole motivation by the time I got to Sandhurst, and it really chimes with their views on leadership as servant leadership. It's about serving the people that are in your command, and making sure that they are getting the best experience of what they're trying to do. So yeah, it's sort of motivated by trying to do cool stuff, doing hard stuff, which is fun, but also acknowledging that these people are doing really difficult, dangerous things, that they deserve the leadership to get them through that safely.
And Peter, there are lots of questions that roll out of that, but I just wanted for our listeners to really understand the kind of timeline of events here. You graduated from Sandhurst, or what was the story?
No, so I didn't even quite get that far. I've been a reservist for a little while, and went to Sandhurst with the intention of completing the year's commissioning course and then joining the infantry. About 7 months in, I had a pretty catastrophic knee injury, which forced me to leave training. So things were looking pretty good in terms of the direction of travel. but unfortunately it wasn't to be. So I was rather unceremoniously dumped out of the career plan that I had in mind, and was forced to sort of rethink what it was that I would want to do next. So absolutely no criticism of the army. I think it was more my realization that if I wanted to lead soldiers on the ground, I needed a body that was capable of doing that, and that my knee wasn't up to it. So I exited at about 7 months through that commissioning course.
And Peter, that's an incredibly difficult, it kind of rings true to the aspiring professional sportsman that, spent a lot of their formative, childhood and young adulthood really focusing on a particular outcome, and then, having it taken away from you in that sense, through your body letting you down. That must have been like, an incredibly challenging thing to go through. Can you recall kind of what the feelings and experiences were like for you at that time? And also you mentioned, I think so in a slightly sort of blasé way, which I think is such a lovely sort of way to approach this sort of conversation. But, you just picked yourself up and went again and said, right, these are my cards. What am I going to do next? Just talk us through, what that experience was like for you.
I think, to be fair, I've probably condensed that in my head, because it wasn't quite as easy as that makes it sound. I think it was, to my mind, I planned to have a military career, and I'd been found suitable to have a military career by that system. So it was really difficult when that didn't materialize. And I sort of reverted to what I thought I might have done prior to joining the military, or if I couldn't have joined the military, which was thinking about policy and politics, and started thinking about jobs in, I picked up a job working at a behavioural science consultancy in Westminster, in a sort of junior role, sort of project management and that sort of stuff. But very quickly realised that it wasn't really for me. So I think it's more having gone from sort of the dream job. The first job after the dream job was never going to be right. So I happened to, I was with my family over Christmas, and I had an uncle who manages a large rural estate up in Norfolk, and I was sort of complaining to him about how miserable it was that I'd lost my dream job and that I was doing something I wasn't really enjoying. And he said, have you thought about working on a rural estate? There's loads of different things going on. They could keep you busy. It'd be quite interesting. So I had no idea that this world really existed. This world of land and farming and forestry and historic houses and that sort of stuff. And I effectively just Googled and found an estate that was advertising a role that was relatively near to where I lived. And it was looking at planning and development. So it was promoting the development of 4,000 new homes and a science park in in sort of sustainable, walkable communities. And I thought, yeah, why not give that a crack, see what happens? And luckily that my boss at the time, I think he recognized the sort of approach to life as opposed to specific skills, because I had no experience in that particular field, and he just thought, yeah, this guy will do. And I remember very early on when I started working there, we went to a community meeting, and he introduced me as a generalist with a brain, which I took as a compliment, and I'm not sure he intended it as a compliment at the time. But no, I think
Peter, I've just that is a sensational LinkedIn headline bio.
Generalist with a brain.
I think that's brilliant. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, so I think actually that has stuck with me, and it sort of characterized my approach to life, which is sort of approach to professional life, which is to be inquisitive and to ask questions and to get involved in stuff, and sort of I try to apply a bit of thought and a bit of consideration to problems that people are facing, and effectively I bounced through the business doing different things like that. Working on strategic land and development, started thinking about how do we integrate biodiversity and carbon considerations into the way we bring those sites forward. From that led into a more broader sustainability role across the business, looking at mostly carbon, because it's something we haven't really engaged with substantially. And then over time, translated that into a full-time sustainability focused role, which now looks at all of our operations from farming, forestry, leisure, property development, and hospitality, and sort of everything in between, which obviously necessitates a generalist with a brain, because I work with all the experts. All the experts are the people I work with on a regular basis, who are driving the tractors or who are refurbishing the property. I'm the guy who needs to sort of ask questions, challenge, and sort of help funnel them towards that overall strategy that we are developing and we continue to develop towards net zero, towards biodiversity restoration. And yeah, hopefully having some reasonable effect in that role.
And Peter, that was beautifully and eloquently described. Let me ask you about, I want to draw the commonality, if you like, or the line of thinking from, your intention with your military career, and you mentioned this whole notion of leadership and what drove you to want to go down the officer training route, and then obviously the first role that you mentioned after the dream job, if you like, was working in behavioral science, relating to politics, relating again to leadership and policy and affecting change. In terms of now looking at what you've then gone on to do with Gascoigne Estates and in estate management and planning, are you getting that sort of that itch, if you like, and that satisfaction that clearly has been a part of your thinking throughout your career of leading and affecting change and affecting policy in the role that you're doing now?
Yeah, definitely. I think when I transitioned into this full-time sustainability role, the chief exec was very clear that it's a senior leadership level, it's a policy and a strategy role, which also delivers on operations and implementation. So I sort of act as a challenging, critical friend at a policy level, developing the way that we should approach things, developing the way that we're approaching questions like land use, but also making sure that I'm still working as closely as I can with the people who are delivering on the ground. So I don't have a team. I don't have an enormous team. I have currently one guy working for me who's an ecologist, but actually it's because the way that we treat sustainability at Gascoigne is that every job is a sustainability job. So actually the team is delivering sustainability on a daily basis. They're delivering it through the way we farm. They're delivering it through the way we treat our properties. And my job is to sort of act as a force multiplier. So effectively, I'm a sort of catalyst for change. And the sort of leadership side, I think ultimately sustainability change is a social problem. It's about making connections between people and building confidence so that they can go on to do their own thing. I think if we silo sustainability in its own little team within a business, you very quickly become an accountant or you very quickly become a data collector, when actually what you want to be doing is inspiring other people to make the decisions and make the leaps that they otherwise wouldn't have done. So, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, Peter, sorry, you were in full flight. But you touched upon your CEO. Just touch upon the role that, in your mind, the CEO of an organization plays in facilitating that type of environment and that type of approach. It's something that's come up in previous episodes, and I'm so interested as somebody who's working closely with the CEO of the organization and is now taking that approach to sustainability. Just touch on their role in setting the agenda.
Well, I think his role in our case has been, he's been around, he's been with us for 5 years, and in that time, about 5 years, and in that time, we have, I think, developed this really strong common language about what it is we're trying to achieve. And sometimes it can feel a little bit contrived at the beginning, where you're sort of trying to use a new word to describe a concept you've always been talking about. But actually what it means is that we now have this series of goals which we're all aiming for, we all understand. And we have this common language which enables us to talk to each other about the same problems. So he's effectively managed to set that vision, set that strategy. He's elevated one of our goals is positive environmental impact. So we now measure our projects against their delivery of the goals. And therefore, when people are thinking about a development project, or they're thinking about a change of land use, they're thinking, does this deliver a positive environmental impact? And those words are now on the tip of everybody's tongues all the time. So he's been very successful at setting that clarity, setting that vision, and setting that language. and then allowing the rest of us to sort of understand that and navigate within that framework. Which interestingly sort of speaks to he's ex-military, and it sort of speaks to that mission command thing where you have, I'm going to tell you what we need to achieve, and you're going to tell me how we're going to achieve it. And it's been really successful in the time that he's been around.
Fascinating. And I imagine for you working with somebody like that, there's a real synergy in the way that you both view the approaches that need to be taken to resolving some of these issues. And you must feel incredibly empowered and supported by somebody who has a similar frame of reference when it comes to decision making and strategy. Let me ask you, Peter, how long have you been I know you mentioned, various roles that you've had at Gascoigne over the years, but in terms of this far-reaching, all-encompassing sustainability leader role, how long have you been doing that for?
At Gascoigne for about 2.5 years in this current role, but obviously then the prior roles included those elements of sustainability before that role became formalized.
And my question with that is that in those 2.5 years, what could you pick out any particular headlines for things that have developed? You mentioned the commonality of language and how you're going about analyzing the work that you're doing, but yeah, can you share with us any particular highlights from your perspective of progress that's been made?
Yeah, so I think there's been a substantial cultural shift in the way that we prioritize particularly environmental issues. We published a net zero strategy in the autumn of last year, which is some might say that it lacks some detail in terms of precise routes of how we're going to do things, because I think at this point we're not in a position to say precisely what those things are going to be. We work in really hard to abate sectors, particularly in property and development and in agriculture. But what it did do is make a public commitment, signal intent, and also got board support and buy-in. So, we've effectively managed to raise the profile of environmental issues throughout the business, and at every level, from the most junior team member to the chairman of the board, which has been a real journey. And it was hard won. It took a lot longer than I thought it would, but for the right reasons, because then we ended up with the right product at the end.
Peter, sorry, let me ask on that. What were the what were those obstacles? What were those difficulties that you had to overcome?
It's just sensitivities, right? It's we are not obliged by regulation to disclose anything. So we could just very quietly skip under the radar. Nobody would know what we're doing or what we're up to. And I think historically, there was a bit of an aversion to openness. And the tussle was slightly about how open do we want to be. And I think we came to the right conclusion, which is that we want to be clear about what it is we're doing well. We want to be open about the challenges that we face in our operations. But we want to be very clear about the fact we're committed to this and that it's a priority for us. So yeah, it was really that negotiation between the board and their desire to retain the privacy that they've enjoyed so far, and sort of me saying, I'm not sure how much longer that's going to last, and we should definitely get on the front foot and be thinking about communicating proactively about these things.
Oh, music to my ears, Peter. I love we to hear the notion of proactive disclosure and getting on the front foot, and the liberation. We talk to a lot of our signatories and organizations we work with about the disarming and liberating nature of being proactive in terms of disclosing these, where you are, where you're not so good, what you're doing to address those issues, etc. It really is I think the state that the majority of organizations would like to find themselves in. So it's fantastic to hear that you guys are adopting that. One last question. It was brilliant. Before we started this recording, Peter was like, I don't know if we're going to be able to do 20 minutes on me, but we've absolutely way beyond the 20 minutes on you, Peter. But I want to ask you one more question about looking forward and your kind of vision for the rest of your career. I know this can be a slightly difficult question to answer, but when you get to the end of your career and you're looking back, what are the things that you want to be able to say about what you've done?
I felt like I knew this question was going to come up because I think I heard you ask it to somebody the other day. I I think about impact and I think about scale. And for me, I think impact can be delivered through a role like a sustainability focused role about sort of environmental impact, or it can be delivered in a sort of general executive role of the business, and that sort of cultural transition to delivering sort of sustainable regenerative business. So there's a sort of impact side, and there is a scale side of we need to do this stuff big and fast and now. And particularly as it comes to land use and nature, actually being able to, the most satisfying thing I think is when you can point at something and you say, we did that and it's done a good thing. And on a very simplistic level, that might be an area of tree planting that's been done recently, or it might be actually when you achieve a landscape scale nature restoration project, while also balancing all these different issues around generating food, building houses, generating energy. So without being too specific about what that looks like, I think if I can turn around in 30 years and say that I've had an impact on the thing that I was doing and that impact was at scale, those are the criteria I think for success for me.
Well, I think for any of our listeners listening into this conversation, Peter, I think we can all say that we're all fairly confident that you're gonna nail it. Right, let's move on, if possible. Would you mind, Peter, just providing a bit of a summary for our listeners of, I think it was a piece by Robert Sheesbury, if I've nailed that or butchered that, Chief Executive of the Agricultural Industries Confederation. Would you mind just providing a bit of a summary and then just picking out whatever the most interesting points were for you in that piece?
Yeah, sure. And feel free to stop me because there's quite a lot of thoughts. So it's an article that is effectively saying we need to get serious about food security in the UK, and here's how. And as you say, was written by the Agricultural Industries Confederation. They're effectively a trade body for the input side of the agricultural industry. So they provide animal feed, fertilizer, seed, agronomy, all the different things that enable the sort of modern farmer to go about their business. But I think the fact they're a trade association is obviously a key influence in the way that they've gone about this. Underlying that blog or that article is a paper by Anglia Ruskin University, and I've read that paper as well. It's a well-researched, interesting piece of work, and effectively the analysis they come to is that the UK needs an independent food security committee, which would try to harmonise food security against broader agricultural output and sustainability. I think their basic concern is that you've got increasing legislation around net zero and decarbonisation. You've got increasing push towards nature restoration and freeing up land for that sort of use. You've got an increasing amount of land being used to grow energy crops for either anaerobic digestion or transport fuels. So they're sort of seeing their area of food crops being squeezed, and they're concerned about that, as a trade association would be. So far so uncontroversial, but I think a couple of things strike me about it. One is that how profoundly it overlaps with several other reports and strategies that have come out in recent years. So the ones that come to mind are Henry Dimbleby's National Food Strategy, which was commissioned by the government, then dropped by the government, which led to what I think is basically a very angrily written book that turned out to be fantastic, called Ravenous by Henry Dimbleby, which I recommend to anybody, about the food system. It overlaps with the House of Lords, who recently advocated for the creation of a land use framework for England, which would advise on how we'd optimize those different outputs. Royal Society had a similar attempt at multifunctional landscapes. So, how do you deliver multiple benefits from this finite resource, which is land? And as often Mark Twain is quoted as saying, though is very dubious whether he ever said it, is buy land, they're not making it anymore. So, that we acknowledged and it acknowledges in the article that land is finite, it's precious, we need to make it do more. But the question is, do more of what, I think. So yeah, this is, and lots of different overlaps with things that already exist that are all trying to deal with the same problems, but maybe from different ends of the telescope. And that's interesting how it comes out. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Peter, that, by the way, that was a brilliant summary. We'll obviously link to the articles for listeners to have a read of it themselves. I have to admit, I feel like this is a subject that I've got sort of a dangerous level of understanding and of knowledge of. Forgive me if I make some ill-informed observations, but my partner Vic actually works at Riverford Organic, so I get a little bit of the insight from her about some of the issues around food security in the UK. Some really quite terrifying observations on potential food shortages, etc. Can you just touch on, though, Peter? You mentioned the Food Security Committee. What's your take on that? Is that a good idea in your mind? Is that something that needs to come into force, or what's your take on that suggestion?
I think that it is a good idea, but I think it might be too overlapping with other things that are emerging. And effectively, if you've got a food strategy and you've got a food security strategy and you've got a land strategy and you've got a land use framework, you've got all these different things which are all pulling in roughly the same direction. Sure. Actually having another independent body with a specific focus on that may not be the right answer. And it also, I think, quite critically, and that's something which this approach hasn't done. You go through the sort of 50 odd pages of the report from ARU, it doesn't actually attempt to define food security, which is, I think, a problem. And I think that plagues the entire debate around food security. People, it's the first thing that people raise a flag on at a protest, or it's a very easy soundbite, but actually people don't really engage with what it actually means. So from their perspective, a food security committee would effectively be charged with securing domestic food supply, and domestic supply of what? I mean, it's intriguing within the report that they make a distinction between food and animal feed, which is something which I also make a distinction between, but is actually not very well considered when you think about the wider food security question. So yeah, I mean, are they, for example, aiming for higher levels of self-sufficiency? Do we want to eat more of what we produce ourselves? They might be, but that's not what they're saying. They're just talking about securing increased productivity. And that can be growing more feed wheat to feed to livestock. It could be growing more barley to turn into beer. It could be growing anything, provided that they can provide the agricultural inputs, which then underpin that production. So, the point about potential food shortages and whether we are truly food secure, I think is completely valid. Tim Lang, who's a professor at City University, would talk about our pretty appalling lack of ability to defend our supply lines militarily if they were under threat. We import a lot of food, but we don't actually have the military capability to defend those supply lines in the event of a crisis. Or the alternatively, that I think a better definition of food security is one that's brought forward by it was established in the 90s, but it's effectively adopted by the UK government, which is about all people at all times having physical and economic access to sufficient, safe and nutritious food. And when you add the people element to it, you think we're in a world where 3 million people used food banks last year. So do those people have the economic and the physical access to food? And is that food safe and nutritious? Probably not. And in a world where we are 1.5 million tons of food is wasted before it even leaves the farm, do we actually have a production problem, or do we have a distribution problem? Mm-hmm. Or do we have a land use optimization problem? And I think actually it's the last two. It's not necessarily we need to produce more stuff. It's that we need to make sure the stuff we do produce is being eaten and is being used in its most effective way. And if you can do that, then you can free up land for other things.
Peter, I was going to come on to sort of what out of all of this, I was going to conclude with, what would be the suggested strategy and next steps, but you've just literally provided a sort of a beautiful synopsis of exactly what we should be doing next. Let me ask you though, on that, I think you mentioned about the role of of the CEO you've worked closely with at Gascoigne, regarding that commonality of language and setting kind of providing that as the sort of foundation from which we can all talk the same language, and everybody within the organization can then think about how we address some of these issues. Do you think that is part of the problem when we look at land use and in particular in this instance food security within the UK, is that, as you mentioned, we've got lots of different bodies basically doing similar things, looking to address the same things. We haven't got commonality of definition, of language, etc. Is that almost the starting point that we all need to get onto the same page before we can look to address these issues?
So I think it is, but I also don't think it's realistic, because land use and land is a really complex and dynamic system, and you've got the intersection of personal interests, of financial interests, of environmental concerns, of these externalities which aren't being properly priced. You've got the needs of future generations in terms of house building. You've got the needs of current generations in terms of food. You've got the needs of sort of somewhere in between the two of greening the electricity grid and making space for energy production on land. And it's interesting some of the ways that these connect with each other. That the UK Food Security Review talks about one of the biggest threats to UK domestic food production being the decline in natural capital and the decline in biodiversity, because of the value of those things to the agricultural system. So I guess to try to come to really, really tightly defined, well understood terms in a context which is so deeply complex is really, really challenging. And I think where we would be better off, and I think preparing for the podcast, you're talking about, if you could wave a magic wand, what would you do? So again, I'm sort of ruining your format. I apologize.
Go on.
I think we need to get better at embracing that complexity and accepting that these things are really difficult and that trade-offs are inevitable, and placing people at the center of that conversation and thinking, okay, well, in a world where we're not producing as much feed wheat, for example, how do we make sure that the people managing the land, the farmers or whoever else it may be, are able to make a decent living out of the food that they produce? That is, it's a common theme throughout the Henry Dimbleby work, is a common theme throughout the Land Use Commission work. It's saying, actually, we don't have a food production system which gives people a way of making a decent living. And quite understandably, then, when you ask them to do other stuff, they get quite annoyed, because they're like, I've got a hard enough time as it is. And then when you think about things like solar, if you try to put a solar farm anywhere near a village, everyone's going to kick off about it. And it's amazing how much interest is generated in agricultural land classifications and food security at the point at which the view over the fields to the back of your house are going to be compromised. And that's not to belittle the significance, the emotional significance of losing that view, or of the change that would be taking place around you. It's obviously a really visceral, important thing for that person, but there are trade-offs that need to take place in the way that we manage our land, and we just need a better, more robust, more honest conversation about what those things are, and try to equitably share the benefits that are derived from them. So that's a very long and unclear answer to your question of can we make things simpler. So I can only apologise.
No, but it's Peter, that was a brilliant response. I'm so pleased that you've the way you've explained that, and the way that you've defined, if you like, the requirement for appreciation of complexity and as you say, the trade-offs, and for everybody to get a little bit more, perhaps a little bit less idealistic, perhaps a bit more real about the implications of one decision over the other is kind of what I've deduced from what you've described there. How hopeful are you about the UK's ability to be able to, move forward with its land use program and ultimately to become better at using its land efficiently and effectively for all of the outcomes that you described?
I'm massively hopeful, actually. I think we've got a new Labour government, and they've come in and made themselves pretty unpopular on a number of different issues. I think they've done some good stuff. and they've done some other things which have been controversial in the industry that I work in. But actually, I think what they are realizing is that this is the critical time to start solving these problems, because we've got this sort of overlapping crisis situation where we're all desperately overweight and dying of diet-related ill health, and that is costing the NHS billions of pounds a year. We are still seeing carbon emissions in agriculture, in forestry, in all of those sort of land sectors struggling to really grapple with that. We're still seeing a need for enormous quantities of housing, because otherwise young people will not be able to afford to live in this country, or have to continue moving north until they end up in the North Sea. They are effectively every major policy lever that this government is trying to pull, whether it's on health, whether it's on housing, whether it's on nature, it all comes back to land. And it all comes back to the question of how do you do what we need to do with the land resource that we've got. They're going to get some of it wrong, and actually I think some people would argue they've already got a lot of it wrong, but actually they're trying to do something incredibly difficult. And I think the energy that they're giving it across those different things is real, and it's tangible, but it needs to be more connected across different government departments. But then I think more importantly, on the private side, actually we're seeing a real momentum building behind certain things which I think are really positive. So the move towards regenerative agriculture, I'm not naive to it. It's still a minority sport in agriculture, but this idea of looking after your soil, of integrating nature and natural features into your landscape, is an integration of livestock into your farming rotation. These things as a system of farming which sort of hark back to the pre-industrial farming system, but actually benefit from modern technology. You've got the Groundswell Festival in Hertfordshire, which has grown from a couple of tents in the field to being the sort of landmark thing of the calendar year, which is all about regen ag. You've got Wild Farmed, Andy Cato, who's come forward with this really interesting commercial proposition where they effectively give you a premium for farming in an environmentally friendly way. And then the wheat that you produce gets turned into bread, which is then food that people eat, instead of a commodity which is traded internationally with a sort of minimal price for the producer. So, there's a lot within the food system debate that is moving in the right direction. And I think we're starting to realize these connections. And I think that as time goes on, and as businesses like Wild Farmed and as individual land managing businesses start making these positive changes, we're going to reach that tipping point where we go, oh, it makes so much sense. This is how we produce food while looking after the planet. This is how we make sure that people are paid properly for the work that they do. This is how we make sure that people have healthy, nutritious diets. And it's the work of people like Henry Dimbleby, and it's the work of people like Andy Cato that is really sort of driving that narrative, and they're doing a fantastic job.
And Peter, it's interesting. Victoria, my partner, was at Groundswell this year and spoke about how she's been to it for the last few years, and noted how it's even evolving, quite starkly over the course of the last couple of years. So it's great to hear these things gaining momentum as they are. One of the common themes that comes up on the Responsible Edge often is the role and requirement for partnership and collaboration across industry partners, government, regulation, etc. When you look at the land usage, land planning kind of sector, if you like, how well do you feel it is engaging with itself in that sense, in terms of partnership and collaboration?
I think massively. One of the real benefits of land and landed businesses is that you can't pick them up and move them. So actually, what I found in this industry is that you're able to share things, and you're able to communicate in a way which you wouldn't be if you were in direct competition with another business. We are regularly going to visit other farms, other estates, other forestry operations to work out what they're doing really well and how we might apply it to us. And likewise, we are frequently hosting those same sorts of return visits. And there's this really open knowledge sharing and collaboration that takes place across this industry. I think that's certainly at the sort of estate level, when you're talking about individual farmers, I think often they're busy farming, they're busy doing their jobs, and at a smaller scale, it's really, really difficult. And therefore, the sort of mental bandwidth to actually be able to share those sorts of conversations is more difficult. But there are ways of through farmer clusters, which have been really successful all over the country, and where farmers are voluntarily getting together to share best practice and to tackle things like water pollution. We're also associated with an organization called the Environmental Farmers Group, which started in the Southwest, but is now spreading across the country. And that is acting as a trusted navigator and advisor to farmers in engaging with natural capital markets. And how do you make money out of restoring nature? And, it's operating as a cooperative. And therefore, there is a membership model where everybody benefits when somebody does a trade. So there are ground up, bottom up approaches to this, which are kind of gathering that communal knowledge, and trying to make something out of it. It's hard work because people are busy and they've got farms to run. But actually, you've got that. You have got a desire for collaboration at every level. And I think the question for government is, how do you properly incentivize that sort of tipping point, so that people can then really engage in the things that they want to do and deliver those national targets that we all know we need to deliver.
And Peter, just one last question on that and the relationship between the private sector and government. And you've touched upon this, and I don't want you to say anything that you don't feel comfortable saying, and I'll ask it this way. In fact, sorry, I'm going around myself a little bit here, but in terms of the work that you've done at Gascoigne and the things that you've observed and learned about how you manage, your estate and how your approach to land management, works, what would be your number one or a few bits of absolutely key advice that you'd offer to the government in terms of how to apply, the lessons that you've learned at a national macro level?
I think the first one is you have to acknowledge and engage with the idea that these businesses operate on an intergenerational level. So in almost all cases, you are thinking about, is the decision I'm making today going to negatively impact my successors' ability to do their job, or to manage the farm or the estate in a viable way? And when you overlay that with political timescales, you can see the problem, because effectively this government has a massive majority, but they've really only got about 3 years to do anything before they have to think about the next election and what they're going to do next. So, an openness to the fact that we're operating on completely different timescales, and we are making decisions today which are only going to bear fruit in 50 to 100 years' time. That is a real challenge that I think every politician of every party needs to grapple with, and some understand it better than others. I think the other thing is providing that certainty and that over that planning horizon. We've in recent months we've seen changes to inheritance tax. Let's not get into the rights and wrongs of it. We've seen a sped up reduction in terms of direct payment subsidy for the basic payment scheme that was previously EU but was adopted. And we don't have the long-term certainty over the environmental schemes, which have sort of been brought in to replace those basic payment subsidies. So if you want farmers who are operating on that intergenerational timescale, you want them to make the right decisions today, then we need to give them the certainty that they're not going to be selling the farm in 5 years' time because they made the wrong decision. And you've got an industry which in some respects can be quite risk averse. So actually it's about being really clear and really supportive and saying, this is the direction of travel. Give us a narrative, give us a vision, and then actually put the groundwork in to support the delivery of that vision.
Peter, here. Let's have some long-term joined up thinking from those in power about these things. I think we apply that across all sectors. Peter, is brilliant. Now, I know you've been slightly naughty and already used the magic wand once already on this show, but I'm in a giving mood today, so I'm going to hand you the magic wand back and ask you to conclude with this. So, Peter, if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I'm going to have to come back to the complexity point, right? It's But I think it goes beyond the land question. It goes beyond the food and farming question. I think generally speaking, businesses like to make simple statements about simple things, and because they're effective, people understand them. But actually, we know that all of these issues we're dealing with are complex. They're interrelated. They are mutually reinforcing. They're all those horrible scientific-y sounding words, which basically mean they're all getting worse at the same time together. And we can't afford to be coming up with the simple solution to the problem, which is inherently complex. So it's let's get comfortable with the gray area between where we know we need to be, where we are today, and the risks we need to take to get there. Let's try some stuff. Let's actually be open to taking a little bit of a risk around what we can do. And if it goes wrong, be honest about it and be open about it and communicate it transparently. And I think that sort of appetite for risk and that desire to communicate openly when we don't quite get things right, because that's part of the process of getting it right. Yeah, that's what I embrace complexity, be willing to get it wrong.
I love it. We have a term that's been used quite a bit recently, and it's not me that came up with this. It was somebody else that came on the show. And again, we're talking big ticket items here, but when broadly talking about the sustainability movement agenda, if you like, they use the term clumsy, and I really like that term. And I think that sort of aligns quite nicely with what you've suggested there. We need to be prepared to appreciate and understand that at this stage, we are going to be clumsy in certain areas, but it's better to be clumsy and open and transparent and share the knowledge and experience with others that they can learn and adapt and evolve and innovate as a result. So I'm absolutely with you, Peter. That was a brilliant Magic Wand suggestion. I'm pleased that I handed it back for go number 2. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today. I've learned a lot about land management. I'm sure our listeners have learned a great deal too. So thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much.
And that's it for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. Big thank you to Peter Mitchell, Head of Sustainability and Innovation at Gascoigne Estates, for joining me for today's show. In the show, we explored the Agricultural Industries Confederation's call for a comprehensive UK food security and land use strategy, as outlined in the 2024 General Election Manifesto. Peter's insights helped us unpack the challenges and opportunities in creating a cohesive, long-term approach to food security, balancing economic growth, environmental stewardship, and community well-being. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Anti-Greenwash Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit antigreenwashcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.